Now, just for the last segment, I want to talk about comments that were made today by Senator Marco Rubio, the Republican of Florida, who is extremely angry. He went on Fox News to complain that other countries, including Brazil, as well as Saudi Arabia and India, are now entering into international trade transactions in which they're using currencies other than the American dollar. And he's angry about that, he says, because if that's permitted, then the American dollar will no longer be the reserve currency of the world, and that in turn will prevent us from sanctioning whatever countries we want to sanction. Let's listen to what he says here in his complaint.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to from now on do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar.
Let's listen to how he describes Brazil, because he's not just angry that any country entered into a transaction without using the U.S. dollar. He's particularly angry that Brazil did it. Why is it particularly offensive for Brazil to do it? Listen to why.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south.
Where is Brazil? In our hemisphere. Brazil's in our hemisphere. We have a doctrine that goes back 200 years called the Monroe Doctrine that says that continent of Latin America belongs to us. There's only one sovereign over Latin America, and that's the United States. That's our backyard. Russia has no legitimate interest in Ukraine right on the other side of its border, but the United States rules all of South America and Latin America. That's our hemisphere, Marco Rubio said. Brazil is the biggest country in our hemisphere, and this is what they've done.
South of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to from now on do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have...
Oh my God, these other countries are creating their own economies, independent of the United States. They're not dependent on the United States any longer, if this keeps up, if they're allowed to do this. Right in our own hemisphere, countries in our hemisphere are doing this. And here's why he's particularly angry about this.
To talk about sanctions in 5 years, because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
Okay, so that's one of the main reasons why he's angry, and he's right about that. The reason why we all hear all the time, the United States goes around and tells the world, these countries are off limits for you to trade with. You cannot trade with Venezuela, you cannot trade with Syria, you cannot trade with Cuba. Iraq was under sanctions for many, many years. There's that notorious video where Madeleine Albright went on 60 Minutes and was asked about the sanctions regime the Clinton administration imposed on Iraq that, according to UN estimates, caused the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. Because when you sanction a country and prevent trade with it, you immiserate the country. You cause starvation, you cause a lack of medication, you never harm the government. It wasn't Saddam Hussein who was being harmed in any way, or his family, by those sanctions. You always end up strengthening the government by weakening the population. And she went on 60 Minutes and she was asked, according to the UN, the sanctions that you supported and imposed on Iraq as a way of punishing Saddam Hussein killed 500,000 Iraqi children. Was that worth it? And she said, I absolutely think it was worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And later on in life, she tried to backtrack a little and claim that was out of context. But it is true that the sanctions regime imposed by the United States on Iraq killed 500,000 people. Syria just had a horrific earthquake, and yet it was very, very difficult for anyone to provide aid to Syrians, not to Bashar al-Assad, he was fine, to the Syrians who suffered in this earthquake, because the U.S. has told the world, you're not allowed to give any money to Syria. Syria is under sanctions. We do the same to Venezuela. We talk about how their country is rife with starvation. People eat dogs, that's the claim. But usually it's not mentioned that they have been embargoed and stranglehold by US sanctions because we're trying to change the government of that country. That's US official foreign policy, is to change the government of Venezuela. As you probably remember, for a long time it was the joke that the United States went around recognizing as the legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, even though he had never received a single vote by any Venezuelans for that position. He was in charge of nothing. It didn't work. When Biden had to go beg Venezuela for oil because the prices were so high and Russia was benefiting, he didn't go to Juan Guaido, he went to Nicolas Maduro, knowing that Nicolas Maduro is the person who actually runs Venezuela. So the whole idea of America First foreign policy is supposed to be that we don't go around changing other countries and their governments. That's for them to do. That's for them to decide. And one of the ways that America First foreign policy is articulated by Donald Trump and his supporters has expressed that view is we shouldn't go and do regime change wars in other countries. We don't go to Libya to take out Gaddafi to help the Libyans. For one thing, it doesn't help them when we do that. It didn't help Iraq when we got rid of Saddam. It didn't help Libya when we got rid of Gaddafi. It caused chaos and slavery, and it brought back ISIS and caused anarchy and a migrant crisis. It was horrific. It was terrible. It was devastating for Libya, like it was for Syria. We didn't take out Assad, but the regime change war there cost Americans billions of dollars and devastated Syria. So if you're opposed to going around the world and trying to change governments through war, why would you support a sanctions regime against Venezuela or Cuba or Syria to change the government of those countries? Why is it your business as an American citizen who runs Venezuela or Cuba or Syria or Iraq? And these sanctions regimes that Marco Rubio was so desperate to maintain does nothing other than make the population suffer, the people who were supposedly trying to help, in the name of trying to take out the regime. It never uproots the regime. It makes the regime stronger. So Marco Rubio has a lot of interest in running other countries. He cares a lot about who the government of Cuba is. He cares a lot about who the government of Venezuela is. He constantly wants to do regime change wars in places like Libya and Syria. Very, very involved in all these other countries. And willing apparently to spend tons of money sending all this money to other countries to change their government, like he's doing now in Ukraine as well. But this anger that the US dollar is going to get overthrown as a currency reserve, which will mean that we can no longer sanction other countries, is actually a good thing. We shouldn't be sanctioning these other countries. That's not our role, to make these other countries suffer in a widespread way because we decide we don't like their government. That's for them to do. And if you really want to uproot the government of Venezuela or Cuba or Syria, the way to do it isn't by making the population suffer with starvation and misery and have their children dying. That weakens the population and makes them more dependent on the government. The way you would do it is to allow trade to flow. Why are American companies prohibited from trading with these countries, from buying oil from Venezuela, or trading with Cuba, or sending aid to Syria? It makes no sense. So to an American ear, this seems normal for Marco Rubio to say the American current dollar has to be maintained as the supreme currency because we need to be able to rule the world through sanctions. Why do you think other countries like Brazil and India are so eager to trade in other currencies? Because nobody wants to be ruled by a single country that dictates to the rest of the world who your government can be and with whom you want to trade. This is the reason there's so much anti-American sentiment. This is why these other blocs are now forming. It's why China is able to lure other countries away from our realm of influence, because this is how we use our influence. Again, I told you this story before about Brazil, just since that's the example Rubio used. In 1964, Brazil had a center-left, not a left, a center-left, democratically elected government. They were desperate to stay neutral in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration told Brazil, if you continue to implement liberal economic policies in your country that you campaigned on and that your voters and citizens approved of, like rent control and land reform, we will conclude that you're moving too close to Moscow and you will pay the price. And when the government of Brazil, the second largest country in our hemisphere, said we're going to continue to implement the economic reforms to get rid of income inequality and wealth inequality in our country, since that's what is causing our citizens to suffer most from, the Johnson administration carried through on its threat. They engineered a coup through the CIA. They got and funded right-wing generals in the Brazilian military. They overthrew the democratically elected government of Brazil, and they imposed a military regime on Brazil that lasted for the next 21 years, in which dissidents were imprisoned and killed and tortured, and journalists were murdered, opponents of the regime were forced into exile. It took Brazil 21 years to redemocratize. In 1985, they had the first presidential election only in 1989. So anybody who is the age of the current president, Lula da Silva, or even a little younger, all lived through that. They understand exactly what it means to have to live under the thumb of the United States. Would you seek ways, alternative ways to create a world if you were a Brazilian who lived through the CIA coup in your country that overthrew your democracy because it didn't like the economic policies of your government and implemented a military regime that ruled as a dictatorship for 21 years? That is why Marco Rubio and people like him are why there's so much of a desire to create an alternative economy and to get away from the hegemony of the United States. And if you're somebody who believes in America First foreign policy, at some point I would like to hear an explanation about why you're only opposed to regime change wars, but not opposed to sanctions regimes that are designed to do the same thing, change the governments of other countries, particularly since they don't work and cause the suffering of millions and millions of people. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, it had three reasons it cited for why it did it. One was the fact that we had troops on Saudi soil, which they regarded as heresy. Another was, which most people regard as a pretext, was our support for Israel over the Palestinians. No one really believed Osama bin Laden cared much about the Palestinians. But the third reason was the fact that we were sanctioning Iraq and it's caused 500,000 Iraqi children to die. Obviously, if you go around the world doing what Marco Rubio has spent his career doing and still wants to do, this message that people hear, of course they're going to move to China or India or other powers and try and undermine U.S. hegemony. We, as Ron Paul, probably the best advocate of all, who has articulated this, although Donald Trump took that baton and saw this sentiment in the Republican Party and built on it and capitalized on it, which is why neocons and the establishment hate him so much, that we should stop going around the world trying to fix every other country and instead focus on ourselves. If that were our posture, there would be a lot less anti-Americanism in the world. Just because we're the most powerful country in the world and the richest country in the world with the biggest military doesn't mean we have to rule every other country, spending all our money to try and topple governments through wars and through sanctions. So what you're seeing here with Marco Rubio, who never was on board with the America First foreign policy, is completely aligned with neoconservatism. Neocons like Bill Kristol and David Frum have always loved Marco Rubio. This is the split in the Republican Party that has to be reconciled, because that mentality that you just heard has nothing to do with stopping wars, stopping endless wars, no longer interfering in other people's countries so we focus on our own citizens instead. This is the opposite of that. And a lot of times foreign wars and regime change wars get attention, but I hope you'll start thinking about sanctions regimes and how they serve the similar purpose, but even worse because they cause more suffering and are less effective. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.